The September sun hung low over the Utah Territory, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape of mountain meadows. The Baker-Fancher wagon train stretched across the valley floor like a serpent of canvas and wood, its 43 wagons forming a protective circle as evening approached. Dust particles danced in the amber light, stirred by the restless movement of cattle and horses that had traveled over 1,000 miles from Arkansas. Captain Alexander Fancher wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he surveyed the encampment. At 55, he had led countless wagon trains across the treacherous Western Territories, but something felt different about this journey. The air itself seemed thick with an unspoken tension that had been building since they'd entered Utah Territory 3 weeks prior. "Water's running low, Captain," called out William Baker, his co-leader and longtime friend. Baker's voice carried the weight of concern as he approached, his boots crunching against the dry earth. "The springs here should sustain us for a few days, but the locals..." He paused, glancing toward the distant hills where smoke from Mormon settlements could be seen rising into the darkening sky. "What about them, William?" Fancher asked, though he already knew the answer. The reception from the Mormon communities had been increasingly hostile as they'd traveled deeper into Brigham Young's territory. Baker lowered his voice, conscious of the families gathering around their evening fires nearby. "They're refusing to trade with us. No supplies, no fresh horses, nothing. Some of the men are talking about taking what we need." The third leader of their expedition, Charles Mitchell, joined them at that moment. His face was grim, etched with lines of worry that seemed to have deepened over the past few days. "It's worse than that," he said quietly. "I've been talking to some of the scouts. There are reports of Indian war parties in the area, but..." He hesitated, looking around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "But what, Charles?" Fancher pressed. "But the descriptions don't match any of the local tribes. White men painted as Indians, some say. And there's talk of a militia gathering in Cedar City." The fourth leader, John Millam, approached their huddle with quick, nervous steps. His usually jovial demeanor had been replaced by barely contained anxiety. "Gentlemen, we need to discuss our options. I've just spoken with my wife, and she's heard disturbing rumors from some of the other women. Stories about what happened to other wagon trains that refused to pay the tributes demanded by the local authorities." Fancher felt a chill run down his spine, despite the warm evening air. The Utah War had created a powder keg of tension throughout the territory. Federal troops were marching towards Salt Lake City, and Brigham Young had declared martial law. Any outsiders, especially those from Arkansas, a state that had produced some of the most vocal critics of the Mormon faith, were viewed with deep suspicion. "We're carrying too much wealth," Baker said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The gold, the cattle, the supplies, word has spread about our cargo." Indeed, the Baker-Fancher train was one of the wealthiest across the territory in years. Families had sold their farms and businesses to fund this journey to California, carrying their life savings in gold coins and valuable goods. The cattle alone were worth a fortune in the gold rush economy of California. As darkness settled over mountain meadows, the four leaders made their way through the camp, checking on the families under their protection. Children played between the wagons while their mothers prepared simple meals over small fires. The men cleaned their rifles and spoke in hushed tones about the journey ahead. Sarah Mitchell approached her husband as he passed their wagon. "Charles, the children are asking when we'll reach California. What should I tell them?" Charles forced a smile, though his eyes betrayed his concern. "Tell them we'll be there before the first snow, my dear. Just a few more weeks." But even as he spoke the words, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Throughout the day, he had noticed figures moving along the ridgelines surrounding the meadow. When he'd pointed them out to the other leaders, they had vanished like ghosts into the rocky terrain. As the camp settled into an uneasy quiet, the four leaders gathered one final time near Fancher's wagon. The captain had spread a map across a wooden crate, the paper illuminated by the flickering light of a lantern. "We have 3 options," Fancher said, his finger tracing possible routes. We can continue south through the traditional route, but that takes us deeper into Mormon territory. We can attempt to circle back north, but that adds weeks to our journey, and we're already running low on supplies. Or we can try to negotiate safe passage, Milam finished. Pay whatever tribute they're demanding, and hope they honor their word. Baker shook his head firmly. I don't trust them, John. The way they've been looking at us, the refusal to trade, this feels like a trap. Everything feels like a trap out here, Mitchell said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. But we have to make a decision. We can't stay in this meadow indefinitely. The wind picked up, causing the canvas covers of the wagons to flutter and snap like ghostly wings. In the distance, a coyote howled, its mournful cry echoing off the surrounding hills. The sound seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, as if the very landscape was holding its breath. I'll ride out at first light, Fancher decided. There's a Mormon settlement about 10 miles south. I'll try to arrange a meeting with their leaders, see if we can come to some arrangement. You shouldn't go alone, Baker protested. If something happens to you, if something happens to me, you three will get these people to California. Fancher interrupted. That's what we promised their families back in Arkansas, and that's what we'll do. As the leaders prepared to retire for the night, none of them noticed the shadowy figures that had been moving closer to their camp throughout the evening. Hidden among the sagebrush and rocky outcroppings, men with painted faces and weapons waited for the signal that would transform Mountain Meadows from a place of rest into a scene of unimaginable horror. The last thing Captain Fancher saw before entering his wagon was the silhouette of a rider on the distant ridge, motionless against the star-filled sky. For a moment, their eyes seemed to meet across the darkness, and Fancher felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool mountain air. Tomorrow would bring answers to their questions about safe passage. But tonight, as the four leaders of the Baker-Fancher wagon train settled into what they believed would be a peaceful sleep, death was already moving through the shadows, preparing to claim its first victims in what would become one of the most notorious massacres in American history. The wind continued to howl through Mountain Meadows, carrying with it the scent of sage and something else, something that made the horses restless and the dogs whine softly in the darkness. Something that spoke of blood and betrayal, of faith twisted into fanaticism, and of the terrible price that would be paid when morning came. The first scream shattered the pre-dawn silence at exactly 4:17 a.m. Sarah Mitchell bolted upright in her bedroll, her heart hammering against her ribs as the sound echoed across the sleeping camp. For a moment, she thought it might have been a dream, a nightmare born from the growing tension of their journey. But then she heard her husband's voice, urgent and terrified, calling out from somewhere near the center of the camp. "Charles," she whispered into the darkness, reaching for the space beside her where he should have been sleeping. Her hand found only cold canvas and empty blankets. Outside their wagon, chaos was beginning to unfold. Voices rose in confusion and alarm as other members of the wagon train awakened to the sounds of distress. Dogs barked frantically, and cattle lowed in agitation, sensing the fear that was spreading through the camp like wildfire. William Baker's wife, Elizabeth, emerged from her wagon, clutching a shawl around her shoulders. "William," she called out, her voice cracking with fear. "William, where are you?" But William Baker would never answer his wife's call again. Near the eastern edge of the camp, young Timothy Fancher, the captain's 16-year-old son, stumbled through the maze of wagons, calling desperately for his father. The boy's face was pale in the dim starlight, his eyes wide with a terror that seemed to age him years in mere moments. "Pa! Pa! Where are you?" Timothy's voice broke as he searched, but Alexander Fancher, like the other leaders, was nowhere to be found. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep over the mountains, the horrible truth began to reveal itself. Martha Milam, John's wife, was the first to discover the scene that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. She had been searching for her husband near the supply wagons when she saw the dark stains in the dirt. At first, in the dim light, she thought it might be spilled molasses or coffee. But as she moved closer, the metallic scent hit her nostrils, and she realized with growing horror what she was looking at. Blood, pools of it, soaked into the earth and splattered across the sides of the wagons. Martha's scream brought the others running. Men grabbed rifles and lanterns, while women gathered their children close, forming protective circles around the youngest members of their party. The camp that had been a place of rest and hope just hours before had transformed into a scene of nightmare. "Dear God in heaven," whispered Reverend Robert Fancher, the captain's brother, as he held his lantern high and surveyed the carnage. "What has happened here?" The evidence of the attack was scattered across a wide area, telling a story of violence so brutal that even the hardened frontiersmen among the wagon train struggled to comprehend it. Drag marks in the dirt led away from the camp toward the surrounding hills, and pieces of torn clothing hung from the sagebrush like macabre decorations. But it was young Samuel Knight, barely 18 years old, who made the discovery that would forever scar his memory. Following one of the blood trails, he found what remained of Captain Alexander Fancher. The leader of their expedition had been dragged nearly 100 yards from the camp before his attackers had finished their grisly work. His body had been mutilated beyond recognition, dismembered with a savagery that spoke of more than simple robbery or even warfare. This was the work of men consumed by a hatred so deep that death itself was not enough to satisfy their rage. "Don't look," Samuel called out weakly as other members of the party approached. "Please, don't look." But the damage was already done. Word of the captain's fate spread through the camp like a plague, and soon the search parties were discovering the remains of the other 3 leaders. William Baker had been found near the creek, his body bearing evidence of torture before his eventual death. Charles Mitchell's remains were scattered across a rocky outcropping, as if his killers had taken particular pleasure in their work. John Millam's fate was perhaps the most horrific of all. His body had been arranged in a grotesque display that seemed designed to send a message to the survivors. As the sun rose higher, painting the mountains in shades of gold and red that now seemed ominous rather than beautiful, the full scope of the attack became clear. The 4 leaders hadn't simply been killed. They had been systematically hunted, captured, and executed with a level of brutality that defied explanation. "Indians," whispered one of the men, his voice shaking. "It had to be Indians. No Christian man would do such things." But others weren't so sure. The attack had been too precise, too targeted. The killers had known exactly who to take and had left the rest of the camp untouched. No supplies had been stolen, no horses taken. This wasn't a raid, it was an execution. Elizabeth Baker knelt beside the blood-stained earth where her husband had last been seen alive, her sobs echoing across the meadow. Her 3 young children clung to her skirts, too young to fully understand what had happened, but old enough to sense that their world had been forever changed. "Why?" she whispered to no one in particular. "Why would they do this to us? We're just trying to reach California. We never hurt anyone." The question hung in the air like a curse, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. But as the survivors huddled together in the growing daylight, they began to notice other disturbing details. The attack had been carried out with military precision, and the mutilations bore hallmarks of ritual significance that seemed more organized than the random violence of a war party. Moreover, several members of the wagon train reported seeing figures watching them from the hills in the days leading up to the attack. These observers had been too distant to identify clearly, but their presence had been constant and unsettling. "We need to leave," urged Robert Fancher, his voice hoarse with grief and fear. "We need to pack up and get out of this valley before they come back." But even as he spoke, the survivors could see that escape might not be possible. Smoke signals were rising from multiple points around the valley, and the sound of drums echoed from the surrounding hills. They were surrounded, trapped in a natural amphitheater with nowhere to run. As the morning wore on, a delegation of men approached the camp under a white flag. They were dressed as local militia, but their faces were painted in the manner of Native American war parties, a disguise so obvious that it seemed almost insulting to the intelligence of the wagon train members. Their leader, a tall man with cold eyes and a carefully groomed beard, rode forward to address the survivors. "I am Major John Lee," he announced, his voice carrying across the silent camp. "I represent the local territorial government. We've come to offer you protection." The irony of the offer was not lost on the survivors, who could still smell the blood of their leaders drying in the morning sun. But with their own leaders dead and their situation desperate, they had little choice but to listen. "There are hostile Indians in the area," Lee continued, his eyes never quite meeting those of the people he was addressing. "They've been attacking wagon trains and settlements throughout the territory. We can provide you with safe escort to Cedar City, where you'll be under the protection of the territorial militia." The offer sounded reasonable, even generous. But something in Lee's manner, the way he avoided looking directly at the evidence of the morning's carnage, the nervous glances exchanged between his men, suggested that this protection came with a price that had not yet been revealed. As the survivors debated their options in hushed whispers, none of them could have imagined that they were looking at the very men responsible for the brutal murders of their leaders. The painted faces and Indian disguises were part of an elaborate deception designed to hide the true nature of the attack and the identity of its perpetrators. The massacre at Mountain Meadows had begun not with the deaths of the 4 leaders, but with a carefully orchestrated plan that would ultimately claim the lives of nearly every adult member of the Baker-Fancher wagon train. The morning's violence was just the opening act in a tragedy that would shock the nation and expose the dark underbelly of religious fanaticism and territorial politics in the American West. As Major Lee waited for their answer, the survivors of the wagon train faced an impossible choice: trust the men who claimed to offer protection or attempt to flee across hostile territory with their children and elderly members. Either way, they were walking deeper into a trap that had been months in the making. The blood of their leaders was still wet on the ground, but the true horror of Mountain Meadows was only just beginning. The negotiations lasted 3 agonizing hours. Major John Lee sat astride his horse with the patience of a predator, his painted face a grotesque mask of false concern as the survivors of the wagon train huddled together to discuss their fate. Behind him, his men maintained their positions around the valley, their weapons clearly visible despite their claims of offering protection. Inside the circle of wagons, the debate raged in desperate whispers. Without their 4 leaders, the remaining members of the expedition struggled to reach consensus on their next move. Fear and grief clouded their judgment, while the presence of armed men surrounding their camp added urgency to every decision. "We can't trust them," hissed Robert Fancher, his brother's blood still fresh in his memory. "Look at their eyes, the way they watch us. These aren't protectors, they're wolves in sheep's clothing." But Elizabeth Baker, clutching her 3 young children, saw only the promise of safety in Lee's offer. "What choice do we have, Robert? We're surrounded, outnumbered, and our leaders are dead. If we refuse their help, what happens to our children?" The question hung heavy in the air. Around them, 43 families faced the same impossible calculation: trust the men who claim to offer salvation, or risk everything on a desperate attempt to escape across hostile territory. Young Timothy Fancher, thrust into premature leadership by his father's brutal death, stood at the center of the debate. At 16, he was barely more than a boy, but the other survivors looked to him for guidance as the captain's son. "My father always said to judge men by their actions, not their words," Timothy said, his voice cracking with emotion. "These men claimed to offer protection, but where were they when our leaders were being butchered? How did they arrive so conveniently just hours after the attack?" His questions were valid, but they offered no solutions to their desperate situation. As the morning sun climbed higher, the temperature in the valley began to rise, and with it, the tension that gripped the camp. Martha Milam, still in shock from the discovery of her husband's mutilated remains, approached the group with a piece of torn fabric in her hands. "I found this near where John was killed," she said quietly. "It's not from any Indian clothing I've ever seen." The fabric was clearly from a white man's shirt, cotton weave with small blue checks that would have been common among Mormon settlers. The discovery sent a chill through the group, confirming what many had already begun to suspect. Their attackers had not been Native Americans at all. "They're lying to us," whispered Samuel Knight, the young man who had discovered Captain Fancher's body. "The men who killed our leaders are probably among those offering us protection right now." But even with this realization, their options remained limited. The valley was surrounded, their leaders were dead, and their supplies were running dangerously low. Major Lee's offer of safe passage to Cedar City might be a trap, but it was the only path forward that didn't involve certain death in the wilderness. As the debate continued, Lee grew impatient. He rode closer to the wagon circle, his voice carrying a note of barely concealed threat. "Time is running short," he called out. "The Indian war parties are moving closer, and we can't guarantee your safety much longer. You need to make a decision." To emphasize his point, several of his men fired shots into the air, claiming they were warning off approaching hostiles. But the survivors noticed that the shots seemed to be signals rather than warnings, and answering shots echoed from the hills around them. Finally, faced with no viable alternatives, the survivors agreed to accept Lee's offer of protection. The decision was made with heavy hearts and deep misgivings, but the presence of women and children in their party left them little choice. "We'll need to leave most of your wagons behind," Lee announced once their decision was made. "The trail to Cedar City is too narrow for such a large train. You can take only what you can carry." This demand raised immediate protests. The wagons contained not just personal belongings, but the life savings of 43 families, gold, jewelry, valuable goods, and livestock that represented their entire future in California. "Those wagons contain everything we own," protested Robert Fancher. "You're asking us to abandon our entire lives." Lee's response was cold and calculating. "Your lives are worth more than your possessions. The Indians will take everything anyway if we don't move quickly." But the survivors were beginning to see through the deception. The demand to abandon their wagons was clearly motivated by greed rather than safety concerns. Lee and his men were positioning themselves to claim the valuable cargo once the original owners were out of the way. As the afternoon wore on, the survivors were forced to make heartbreaking decisions about what to take and what to leave behind. Family heirlooms passed down through generations were abandoned in favor of basic necessities. Children's toys were left scattered in the dirt as parents chose food and water over sentimental items. Elizabeth Baker watched in anguish as her husband's tools, the instruments of his trade that were to have provided for their family in California, were left behind in their wagon. 40 years of marriage, she whispered to her eldest daughter. 40 years of building a life together, and it all fits in a single satchel. The emotional toll of these decisions was compounded by the growing realization that they were being systematically stripped of everything that might help them survive independently. Lee's men confiscated weapons under the pretense of preventing conflicts with the Indians, leaving the survivors defenseless and completely dependent on their supposed protectors. As evening approached, Lee announced the plan for their departure. "We'll leave at first light," he said. "The women and children will walk together in the center of the column, while the men will be spread out along the flanks for protection. This formation will help us move quickly while keeping everyone safe." But to the more observant members of the group, the formation sounded less like protection and more like a method of control. By separating the men from their families and spreading them out along the column, Lee was ensuring that no coordinated resistance would be possible if his true intentions were revealed. That night, as the survivors prepared for what they hoped would be their journey to safety, several disturbing incidents occurred. Sentries reported seeing figures moving through the abandoned wagons, and the sound of axes could be heard echoing across the valley as Lee's men systematically destroyed anything they couldn't carry away. More troubling still were the conversations overheard between Lee's men when they thought no one was listening. References to finishing the job and leaving no witnesses suggested that the journey to Cedar City might not end as promised. Young Timothy Fancher, unable to sleep, crept to the edge of the camp and witnessed a scene that confirmed his worst fears. In the moonlight, he saw Lee's men dividing up the contents of the abandoned wagons, arguing over the distribution of gold and valuables like common thieves. But most chilling of all was the conversation he overheard between Lee and one of his lieutenants. "The children will have to be spared," Lee was saying. "They're too young to remember details, and killing them would serve no purpose. But the adults..." The lieutenant's response was lost in the wind, but Timothy had heard enough. The offer of protection was indeed a trap, and the journey to Cedar City would be a death march for every adult member of their party. As dawn approached and the survivors prepared for their departure, none of them could have imagined the full scope of the deception that surrounded them. They were not being rescued. They were being led to slaughter by the very men who had murdered their leaders. The massacre at Mountain Meadows was entering its final phase, and the morning sun would rise on one of the darkest chapters in American frontier history. The trap was closing, and there was nowhere left to run. September 11th, 1857. The morning mist clung to Mountain Meadows like a funeral shroud, as the survivors of the Baker-Fancher wagon train prepared for what they believed would be their journey to safety. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, but there was no beauty in the dawn for those who had witnessed the brutal murders of their leaders just days before. Major John Lee surveyed the assembled group with cold satisfaction. 43 families had been reduced to approximately 120 survivors, men, women, and children who clutched their meager possessions and looked to him for salvation. They had no idea they were staring into the face of their executioner. "Form up as I instructed," Lee commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Women and children in the center, men spread along the flanks. We have a long journey ahead, and discipline will keep us all alive. The formation that took shape was a masterpiece of tactical deception. To the untrained eye, it appeared to be a protective formation designed to shield the most vulnerable members of the group. In reality, it was a carefully orchestrated arrangement that would allow Lee's men to eliminate the adult males quickly and efficiently when the time came. Timothy Fancher walked near the front of the column, his young face etched with worry and premature responsibility. As the captain's son, the other survivors looked to him for leadership, but he was haunted by what he had overheard the night before. The knowledge that they were walking into a trap weighed heavily on his shoulders, but surrounded by armed men and with no viable alternatives, he could only hope for a miracle. Elizabeth Baker walked with her 3 children clustered around her, their small hands clutching at her skirts as they struggled to keep pace with the adults. Her youngest, Mary, was only 4 years old and didn't understand why they had to leave their wagon behind, or why her father wasn't coming with them. "Mama, when will Papa catch up?" Mary asked for the 10th time that morning, her innocent question like a knife through Elizabeth's heart. "Soon, sweetheart," Elizabeth whispered, though she knew William Baker would never catch up to anyone ever again. The image of his mutilated body was burned into her memory, a nightmare that would haunt her for whatever time she had left. As the column began to move, Lee's men took their positions with military precision. They were no longer bothering to maintain their Indian disguises, having abandoned the painted faces and feathers in favor of their militia uniforms. The pretense was no longer necessary. Their victims were too isolated and vulnerable to escape, regardless of who their captors claimed to be. The march began slowly, with frequent stops to accommodate the elderly and the children. But as they moved further from the meadow and deeper into the rocky terrain surrounding the valley, the pace began to quicken. Lee seemed increasingly anxious to reach their destination, whatever that might truly be. Robert Fancher, walking near the rear of the column, noticed that they were not heading towards Cedar City as promised. The trail they were following led deeper into the wilderness, away from any known settlements or roads. When he attempted to question one of the guards about their route, he was told curtly to keep moving and not ask questions. "Something's wrong," he whispered to Samuel Knight, who was walking nearby. "This isn't the way to Cedar City. I've traveled these trails before." Samuel nodded grimly. "I know. And have you noticed how they're watching us? Not like protectors watching for threats, but like guards watching prisoners." Their suspicions were confirmed when one of the women attempted to retrieve a dropped item and was roughly pushed back into line by one of Lee's men. The mask of protection was slipping, revealing the true nature of their situation. As the morning progressed, the column was led into a narrow canyon where the walls rose steeply on both sides. The terrain was perfect for an ambush, with no escape routes and limited visibility. Lee called for a rest stop, claiming that the women and children needed time to recover their strength. But the positioning of his men during the rest told a different story. They had taken positions that commanded every possible exit from the canyon, their weapons ready and their eyes alert. This was not a rest stop, it was a killing ground. Martha Milam, still clutching the piece of fabric she had found near her husband's body, approached Timothy Fancher during the break. "That man," she whispered, nodding toward one of Lee's lieutenants. "I've seen him before. He was in Parowan when we passed through last week. He was wearing the same shirt that this fabric came from." The revelation sent a chill through Timothy. If Lee's men had been in Parowan when the wagon train passed through, they had been tracking and planning this attack for days, possibly weeks. This was not a spontaneous act of violence. It was a carefully orchestrated massacre. As the rest period continued, several disturbing developments began to unfold. Lee's men started separating the adult males from the rest of the group, claiming they needed to discuss security arrangements for the remainder of the journey. One by one, the men were led away from their families under various pretenses. "Where are they taking the men?" Elizabeth Baker asked one of the guards, her voice tight with fear. "Just a brief meeting about the trail ahead," the guard replied, but his eyes wouldn't meet hers, and his hand rested nervously on the grip of his pistol. The women and children were left huddled together in the center of the canyon, surrounded by armed men who no longer bothered to hide their hostile intentions. The pretense of protection had been completely abandoned, replaced by the cold efficiency of executioners preparing for their work. Young Timothy Fancher was among the last of the men to be called away from the group. As he was led toward a cluster of rocks where the others had disappeared, he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. Hidden among the boulders were the bodies of the men who had been taken before him, shot execution style and left where they fell. "Dear God," he whispered, realizing that he was looking at his own imminent fate. The guard behind him prodded him forward with the barrel of a rifle. "Keep moving, boy. Your time has come." But Timothy's youth and desperation gave him an advantage that the older men had lacked. As they approached the killing ground, he suddenly broke away from his captor and began running back toward the main group, shouting a warning at the top of his lungs. "It's a trap! They're killing the men! Run!" His warning shattered the tense quiet of the canyon like a gunshot. The women and children looked up in horror as Timothy raced toward them, pursued by armed men who were no longer bothering to conceal their murderous intentions. The massacre at Mountain Meadows was about to enter its final, most horrific phase. The careful planning and elaborate deceptions were over. Now there was only the brutal reality of mass murder carried out by men who had convinced themselves that their cause justified any atrocity. As Timothy's warning echoed off the canyon walls, the surviving members of the Baker Fancher wagon train faced the terrible truth. They had not been rescued. They had been herded like cattle to slaughter, and their executioners were already moving into position to finish what they had started in the pre-dawn darkness of mountain meadows. The March of the Damned had reached its destination, and there would be no journey to California for any of them. The gunshots began at exactly 11:47 a.m., shattering the canyon's silence like thunder from a clear sky. Timothy Fancher's desperate warning had given the survivors perhaps 30 seconds of awareness before the massacre began in earnest. 30 seconds to understand that their protectors were their executioners, that their journey to safety was actually a march to death, and that the men they had trusted with their lives were about to take them with systematic brutality. The first volley came from the rocks above, where Lee's men had positioned themselves with military precision. The adult males who had been separated from the group were cut down where they stood, their bodies falling among the boulders like broken dolls. Robert Fancher, Samuel Knight, and the other men who had led their families across 1,000 miles of wilderness died without ever seeing their killers' faces. In the canyon below, chaos erupted as the women and children realized the horror of their situation. Mothers grabbed their babies and ran for whatever cover they could find, while older children screamed in terror as bullets whistled overhead. But there was nowhere to run in the narrow confines of the canyon, and Lee's men had planned for this moment with meticulous care. Elizabeth Baker threw herself over her 3 children as the shooting intensified, her body serving as a shield against the rain of lead that filled the air. "Don't look," she whispered to them, though her own eyes were wide with terror. "Close your eyes and don't look." But 4-year-old Mary Baker had already seen too much. The little girl, who had been asking for her father just hours before now, watched in mute horror as the world dissolved into violence and blood. The innocence that should have protected her for years to come was stripped away in seconds, leaving behind trauma that would echo through generations. Major John Lee stood on a rocky outcropping above the killing ground, watching the slaughter with the detached interest of a man observing a military exercise. To him, this was not murder. It was a necessary action to protect the Mormon settlements from federal interference. The Baker Fancher wagon train had become a symbol of everything that threatened his people's way of life, and symbols had to be destroyed completely to be effective. "Make sure there are no survivors among the adults," he called out to his men. "The children under 8 can be spared. They're too young to testify against us, but everyone else must die." The order was carried out with ruthless efficiency. Lee's militiamen moved through the canyon like reapers, finishing off the wounded and ensuring that no adult member of the wagon train would live to tell the tale of what had happened at Mountain Meadows. Martha Millam, still clutching the piece of fabric that had revealed the truth about their attackers, was among the last to die. As a militiaman approached her with his rifle raised, she looked him in the eyes and spoke her final words. "God will judge you for this. God will judge all of you." The militiaman's response was a bullet through her heart, but her words would prove prophetic. The massacre at Mountain Meadows would indeed face divine and earthly judgment, though it would take 20 years for justice to find John Lee and his conspirators. As the shooting died away and the canyon fell silent except for the crying of children, the full scope of the atrocity became clear. Of the 120 people who had entered the canyon that morning, only 17 children under the age of 8 remained alive. The rest, men, women, teenagers, and older children, lay dead among the rocks, their blood soaking into the Utah soil. The children who survived would carry scars that no amount of time could heal. They had watched their parents, siblings, and friends murdered in cold blood by men who claimed to be acting in God's name. Some would never speak of what they had witnessed, while others would spend their lives trying to make sense of the senseless violence they had endured. Timothy Fancher, the 16-year-old who had tried to warn the others, lay among the dead with a bullet through his chest. His final act of courage had given the survivors a few moments of truth, but it had not been enough to save them. The boy who had been thrust into leadership by his father's murder had died trying to protect the people who had looked to him for guidance. In the aftermath of the massacre, Lee's men worked quickly to cover their tracks. The bodies of the adults were stripped of valuables and thrown into hastily dug mass graves, while the abandoned wagons back at Mountain Meadows were looted and burned. The livestock was driven away to be distributed among the Mormon settlements, and any evidence that might link the massacre to the territorial militia was carefully destroyed. The surviving children were distributed among Mormon families throughout the territory, their identities changed and their memories suppressed through a combination of trauma and deliberate deception. They were told that Indians had killed their families and that their Mormon guardians had rescued them from certain death. Some of the children, particularly the youngest, eventually came to believe this version of events. But the truth had a way of surfacing, despite the best efforts of those who sought to bury it. Within weeks of the massacre, reports began to reach federal authorities about the disappearance of the Baker-Fancher wagon train. Investigations were launched, witnesses were questioned, and slowly, the horrific reality of what had happened at Mountain Meadows began to emerge. The massacre would become a stain on the Mormon Church and the Utah Territory that would never be fully washed away. It would contribute to the federal government's distrust of Brigham Young's administration and would eventually lead to the replacement of territorial officials with federal appointees. Most importantly, it would serve as a stark reminder of what could happen when religious fanaticism and political paranoia combined with unchecked power. John Lee himself would eventually face justice for his role in the massacre, though it would take 2 decades and considerable political pressure before he was finally executed for his crimes. Even then, he would go to his death claiming that he was merely following orders from higher authorities in the Mormon Church, orders that those authorities would deny to their graves. The 17 children who survived the massacre would eventually be returned to relatives in Arkansas, but they would never fully recover from what they had witnessed. Their testimonies would provide crucial evidence in the eventual prosecution of those responsible, but the price they paid for that evidence was measured in lifelong trauma and shattered innocence. As the sun set over Mountain Meadows on September 11th, 1857, the valley that had once been a place of rest for weary travelers had become a monument to human cruelty and religious extremism. The silence that settled over the canyon was not the peaceful quiet of evening, but the terrible silence of the grave, a silence that would echo through American history as a reminder of the darkest impulses of the human heart. The massacre was over, but its consequences would reverberate for generations. The blood spilled in that remote Utah valley would cry out for justice, and eventually justice would come. But for the 120 men, women, and children who died at Mountain Meadows, justice would come too late to matter. In the end, the Baker-Fancher wagon train had been destroyed, not by hostile Indians or natural disasters, but by the very people who had promised to protect them. It was a betrayal so complete and so horrific that it would challenge the faith of believers and the trust of citizens for decades to come. The silence of the lambs had fallen over Mountain Meadows, and it would never be broken.